You think the Middle Ages were all knights, castles, and chivalry. Think again. Behind the stone walls of cathedrals and castles lurked a world so bizarre, so grotesque, that it makes modern scandals look tame. Imagine priests ordering couples to have sex in front of witnesses, or kings demanding their servants collect used bedsheets to prove whether a bride was a virgin. Imagine trials where strangers were summoned to grope married women legally to test if they were fit for the holy bond. Sounds insane. It gets worse. Because medieval Europe wasn't just obsessed with sex, it was obsessed with controlling it. Every bedroom act could be spied upon, judged and punished, from chastity belts that may or may not have existed, to public confessions of intimate details that make modern reality TV seem like Sunday school. The Middle Ages turned sexuality into a circus of humiliation and cruelty. And what you're about to hear will flip every Hollywood image of romantic knights and fair maidens on its head. This is not a story about love. This is a story about control, about power, about the way sex was weaponized to shame, humiliate, and even kill. Welcome to the 7 levels of medieval sexual madness. They tell us medieval Europe was obsessed with honor, but the truth is uglier. It was obsessed with women's bodies. Virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was currency, reputation, and in many cases, the difference between life and death. And like any currency, it had to be proven, publicly, humiliatingly, and with rituals that make today's tabloid scandals look tame. Imagine a wedding night that doesn't end in privacy, but in a trial, a crowd waiting outside the chamber. A priest, a judge, or even the bride's in-laws demanding proof that the bride was in fact untouched. And how did they prove it? Not with trust, not with love, but with blood. The so-called virginity test was less about biology than it was about theater. Sheets were inspected like crime scene evidence. If they were stained red, the bride was pure. If not, her life could unravel overnight. The medieval world believed a woman's body was a vault, locked until a man's key opened it. And if that key turned too easily, she was branded defective, shameful, even criminal. Entire lawsuits were fought over this so-called proof. Families dragged women into court, accusing them of fraud if no blood was found. And because justice demanded evidence, midwives were called in, not to heal but to probe, poke, and inspect. These women, ironically themselves subject to suspicion, became instruments of humiliation. They examined girls' bodies in front of men, searching for a membrane they barely understood. The irony: biology doesn't work that way. Many women never bled on their first time. Some lost their hymens long before marriage from riding horses or doing labor. But science didn't matter. The medieval courtroom clung to its bloody sheet like a sacred relic. And when no blood appeared, desperation followed. Women cut their thighs or used animal blood to stain the linen, because without that crimson mark, their families could disown them, their marriages annulled, and their reputations destroyed. This wasn't just personal shame, it was social spectacle. Villages whispered about brides who failed the test. Whole communities treated a young woman's body as public property, her worth debated like a market price. In France, some courts even staged the inspections in public squares. Picture it, a woman standing half naked while officials declared her virgin or fraud before a watching crowd. That wasn't just humiliation, it was ritualized cruelty disguised as law. And the absurdity didn't stop there. Some theologians claimed virginity had a glow, a spiritual shine that could be seen on a girl's face. If she looked too confident, too knowing, too comfortable in her own skin, suspicion flared. Virginity was less about truth than about performance. An endless game of pretending, a play where women were judged guilty until proven bloody. For men, none of this applied. No test, no sheet, no trial. Male purity was irrelevant. Virginity was only policed when it belonged to women, because it controlled property, inheritance, and alliances. Behind every virginity trial was a deeper obsession. The fear of illegitimate heirs. A woman's body was the battlefield on which family honor and dynastic power were fought. The cruelty wasn't just in the rituals themselves, but in the hypocrisy. Medieval Europe preached chastity while running brothels, licensed by the very same authorities. Priests thundered about purity on Sunday, then paid prostitutes on Monday. Yet it was always the young bride who bore the shame, her body dissected by rumor, law, and custom. Virginity wasn't just personal, it was political. It decided whether alliances held, whether inheritances were valid, whether kingdoms rose or fell. And in a world so obsessed, no woman could truly win. If she bled, she was pure. If she didn't, she was ruined. The system was rigged from the start. And yet, as invasive and humiliating as these virginity tests were, they were only the beginning, because proving a bride had been untouched before marriage was just step one. The real nightmare began after the wedding, when couples were forced to prove not just purity, but performance. And this next ritual made even the blood-stained sheets look merciful. Because in the medieval world, the bedroom wasn't private, it was a courtroom. And intimacy itself could become a trial. Privacy is a modern luxury. In the medieval world, the bedroom could be a courtroom, and sex itself a public performance. It wasn't enough for a couple to be married on paper. They had to prove their union with flesh. And if whispers of doubt surfaced, whether from jealous rivals, angry families, or suspicious clergy, husband and wife could be summoned to undergo one of the most degrading spectacles in history. The congress, a trial by intimacy. This was no romantic consummation. It was a legal procedure, often ordered by bishops, judges, or noble councils. A couple accused of failing to consummate their marriage might be forced into a chamber, surrounded not by lovers' whispers but by witnesses, sometimes midwives, sometimes priests, sometimes even in-laws, who were there to ensure the act truly happened. Their duty was simple: watch, listen, and record. What should have been private became performance art in the service of law. And these humiliations weren't reserved for peasants. Even kings and queens were not immune. In France, Henry III's first marriage was annulled after examinations concluded he had failed to consummate. Whispered gossip about his body spread across Europe, staining his reputation more deeply than any political scandal. Royal bedding ceremonies, rituals where newlyweds were escorted to their marital bed before a gallery of nobles, blurred into something darker, half ceremonial, half voyeuristic. The line between tradition and trial was razor thin.
What makes it all the more grotesque is the hypocrisy. The same society that branded lust as a deadly sin demanded couples display their lust on command. To modern ears, it sounds like a twisted form of reality television. A medieval proof of concept show where the stakes were life, honor, and dynasty. A divorce court today, forcing a live-streamed sex act, would provoke outrage, lawsuits, and international scandal. In the Middle Ages, it was law.
The cruelty of trial by intimacy didn't end with the act itself. Reports were kept, testimony gathered. Did the man's seed spill? Did the woman sigh? Did her body yield in the proper way? Witnesses wrote such things into official records, reducing human beings to grotesque case studies. Failure meant annulment, disgrace, or worse. Success meant only that one more intimate moment had been stolen, transformed into a circus of humiliation. And still the absurd theater was justified by lofty ideals. Consummation proved fertility, fertility ensured heirs, and heirs meant the survival of dynasties. In the eyes of the church and state, sex wasn't about pleasure or love, it was about property, legitimacy, and control. Your body was evidence, your intimacy a contract. One can almost hear the psychological torment. For couples coerced into congresses, desire curdled into dread. The marriage bed became a stage, every movement an object of scrutiny, every failure an indictment. The most private act of union became the most public act of judgment. and for many that humiliation never washed away. If virginity tests had stripped women of dignity, trial by intimacy stripped couples of humanity itself. It reduced love to a courtroom spectacle and intimacy to a weapon wielded by authority. And yet, as twisted as this practice was, it still had the veneer of fairness. At least both husband and wife were subject to its gaze. But not everyone got even that cruel form of equality, because the church had its own methods, darker and more insidious, of probing into desire. It wasn't satisfied with public sheets or courtroom bedrooms. No, its eyes and ears reached into the confessional itself, where private sins became fuel for exploitation. And what priests demanded to know inside those booths makes the congresses look almost merciful. Confession was supposed to be sacred, a place where souls unburdened themselves, where sin was whispered into the shadows and forgiven. But in the medieval world, the line between salvation and exploitation was razor thin. For some priests, the confessional was less a holy duty than a voyeur's paradise. Behind the solemn curtain of religion, there was something disturbingly erotic. The church demanded absolute honesty from its flock, especially about sins of the flesh. That meant questions, endless questions. A young woman kneeling in the dim light might be asked not just whether she had sinned, but how, in what position, with what frequency, whether she had touched herself, whether she had enjoyed it, and who was listening. A man bound by vows of celibacy but wielding unchallenged authority over her soul. This wasn't spiritual guidance. It was interrogation thinly veiled as penance. Imagine a vulnerable teenager today being grilled by her school principal about every detail of her sex life, with eternal damnation hanging in the balance. That's what confession could feel like in the medieval church, terrifying, invasive, and grotesquely intimate. And it happened so often that even the church itself had to admit the abuse. Synods and councils across Europe issued repeated warnings to priests not to misuse confession. But the fact that those rules had to be written at all is proof enough. It was happening everywhere. Women confessed. Priests listened too closely, and in some cases they went further, demanding private penances that blurred into sexual coercion. Consider the imbalance of power. To a medieval woman, the priest was more than a man. He was a gatekeeper to heaven. His word could condemn her soul to eternal fire. In that context, how could she resist if his questions slid from spiritual into carnal? How could she protest if penance meant something more than prayers? This was not desire, it was manipulation dressed in holy robes. And yet, to the wider world, the illusion of purity remained. Priests thundered from pulpits about the dangers of lust, even as some secretly indulged in it under the cloak of confession. The hypocrisy was staggering. It was as if the very men tasked with policing morality were also exploiting the system to sate their curiosity, their urges, their power. There are chilling accounts of women who dreaded confession more than sin itself, because what awaited them was not absolution, but shame. They whispered about priests who pressed them with questions too intimate, whose interest felt less like concern for their souls and more like hunger. The violation wasn't physical alone, it was psychological, spiritual, emotional. To bear one's conscience only to have it twisted and fetishized was a betrayal deeper than most punishments. And what of the men? Husbands and fathers often suspected, sometimes correctly, that confession had turned into something else. Tension festered. Accusations flew. Priests were caught and censured, but the institution rolled on because the church needed confession. It was the engine of obedience, the system by which every man, woman, and child was monitored. To abolish it would mean losing control. So instead, it tolerated the rot within, issuing warnings while pretending the holy booth remained holy. To modern ears, it sounds like a medieval scandal straight out of a Me Too trial, a system designed to protect becoming the very tool of exploitation. The irony is brutal. The safest space was often the most dangerous. The act meant to free souls, instead trapped bodies, and all of it was cloaked in the language of purity, sanctity, and God's will. Confession at its heart became a stage for hypocrisy, a ritual that turned sin into spectacle, that let priests feast on the very lust they condemned. For women, it was a trap, damned if they spoke, damned if they refused. For men, it was yet another reminder that the church was less a moral authority than a theater of control. And as grotesque as this corruption was, it still had the disguise of holiness. But outside the confessional, things grew even stranger, because medieval medicine, the supposed science of healing, would take this obsession with sex to an entirely new level of absurdity. Where confession turned desire into sin, medicine turned desire into prescription. And what they claimed the body needed will make the abuses of the priests seem almost tame. In the medieval imagination, semen wasn't just the spark of life, it was medicine. To them, this sticky fluid was more than reproductive necessity. It was vitality itself, distilled into liquid form. Physicians, clerics, and scholars wrote with straight faces that semen cured ailments, soothed melancholia, and even sharpened the mind. What we see as biology, they saw as alchemy. So when men spilled their seed, it wasn't just lust, it was healing. Some doctors prescribed semen as a cure for headaches. Others swore it alleviated depression, the so-called sorrow of the womb, infertility. The prescription was obvious, but the logic extended even further. If semen was pure life force, why shouldn't it invigorate those who consumed it, absorbed it, or were bathed in it? Medieval medical manuals described treatments that today read more like parody than science. But for women, the grotesque absurdity turned into nightmare. Because if semen was medicine, then sex could be prescribed, forced, justified, cloaked in the language of healing. A husband who demanded his wife submit might cite doctors' orders. Priests whispered that carnal knowledge wasn't just a right, but a treatment for her ailments. Nobles excused their predation by pretending they were administering medicine. What was theft of the body became, in their minds, charity. Behind this science was a hierarchy of cruelty. Male seed was celebrated as essence of vitality. Female fluids, by contrast, were treated as poison, decay, waste. Medieval scholars described menstrual blood as toxic, dangerous, a pollutant to men's purity. So while men were encouraged to see themselves as life-givers, women were cast as flawed vessels, in constant need of correction through the balancing force of semen. The inequality was written into medicine itself. It is easy to laugh at the absurdity now, to imagine a medieval doctor, quill in hand, prescribing intercourse for migraines. But the laughter fades when you picture the woman at the receiving end of that cure, unable to refuse, her pain turned into justification for exploitation. The grotesque irony is that the very act meant to heal often deepened the wound. Consider the countless women brought to confess their ailments to male physicians and clerics. A headache could earn her a prescription of embracing her husband more vigorously. Melancholy? She was told her womb was suffocating without seed. Even widows and nuns were not safe from the theories. The medical logic claimed their abstinence dried them out, turned their bodies brittle, or left them prey to hysteria. The solution, naturally, was semen, and what better opportunity for the men in power to step in? The absurdity extended even into punishment. Some courts believed sexual exposure could heal women accused of witchcraft or lustful sins. Their very crimes, they argued, came from a lack of male seed. It was pseudoscience used as justification for abuse, draped in the authority of medicine. And the cruelty carried an edge of hypocrisy. While the church thundered from pulpits against fornication, the same intellectual circles quietly endorsed sex as therapy. It was a loophole, desire recast as duty, pleasure reframed as health. Women's bodies became testing grounds for remedies that were never remedies at all. In the end, semen as medicine was more than bad science. It was a license, a way to rebrand lust as treatment, to turn exploitation into compassion, to hide abuse beneath the mask of cure. Behind every medical order was the same reality. Women stripped of choice, their bodies made instruments of men's fantasies. And if medicine could twist sex into healing, then war twisted sex into something even darker. Because beyond the bedchamber and beyond the physician's desk, sex wasn't just therapy, it was weaponry. And when armies marched, it wasn't only swords they carried, it was lust sharpened into terror. War has always been brutal, but in the medieval world, the battlefield didn't end with swords and fire. It extended into the bedroom, into the body, into the most private spaces of the conquered. Sexual violence wasn't a byproduct of war. It was a weapon, wielded with precision, intended to humiliate, intimidate, and destroy entire communities. When crusaders marched into foreign lands under the banner of God, they didn't just kill, they violated. Women in Jerusalem, in Constantinople, in the villages of the Holy Land, were assaulted as trophies, their bodies treated as spoils. Viking raids carried the same terror. Ships on the horizon didn't just mean plunder, they meant women dragged into captivity, violated before their families, sold like cattle in distant markets. Rape was not incidental, it was a deliberate show of dominance, a way to inscribe fear into the very flesh of a population. And yet the cruelty went further. Armies used rape as psychological warfare, knowing it shattered men as much as women. Husbands were forced to watch their wives attacked. Fathers saw daughters taken. The humiliation spread like a disease, breaking not only bodies but the very social fabric that bound communities together. A man who could not protect his household was disgraced. A woman who survived was tainted. In this way, sexual violence did double duty. It inflicted agony on victims and poisoned the honor of entire families. But here lies the true obscenity. Often, it was the victims who faced punishment. Medieval law twisted blame until women bore the guilt of their own violation. Records survive of women whipped, fined, even exiled for tempting soldiers. A rape survivor might be accused of adultery, her assault reframed as consensual sin. The act of violence was rewritten as proof of her corruption, and instead of sympathy, she received the lash. Imagine being brutalized by an invading army only to face trial at home, as if you were the criminal. The hypocrisy is staggering. Lords and knights wrote codes of chivalry, promising to protect the weak, to defend maidens, to honor purity. But when war came, those same codes collapsed like parchment in fire. The knight who swore to protect women in tournaments could violate them in war without consequence. Even kings looked the other way, seeing rape not as crime, but as inevitability, sometimes even as reward for victorious soldiers. The church, too, played its part in the hypocrisy. Sermons thundered about lust as mortal sin, yet armies under papal banners committed atrocities too brutal to describe without flinching. Chroniclers of the Crusades admitted as much, writing that soldiers defiled women even in the holy places. Still, the priests absolved them. Lust was forgivable when cloaked in the cause of Christ. For the women left behind, forgiveness was never an option. The scars of these acts lingered long after the armies moved on. Communities whispered about women who had been dishonored. Some were forced into marriages with their attackers to erase the shame. Others lived in silence, carrying trauma that had no name in medieval vocabulary. To suffer in this way was to lose not only bodily autonomy, but often one's very identity. You became a symbol of defeat, an unwilling banner of your people's humiliation. And yet, despite the horror, history rarely records their voices. Chronicles detail the battles, the sieges, the kings and generals, but the raped woman in the burned-out village remains a ghost. Her story is buried, her suffering excused as part of war's collateral. It is this silence that makes the cruelty echo all the louder, because it was not rare, it was routine. Rape in medieval warfare was more than an atrocity. It was policy. It was terror sharpened into strategy. Humiliation institutionalized, cruelty passed off as custom. And still, for all this agony, medieval society found ways to make things even worse. Because sexual violence didn't stop with women, men too became targets of humiliation, stripped, paraded, and mutilated in ways designed to rob them of dignity forever. And if you thought women suffered alone, wait until you see what was done to men. For medieval men, power was everything. Power over land, power over women, power over their own bodies. But when that power was stripped away, it was done in the most brutal, humiliating fashion possible. Adultery, sodomy, or even mere accusations of unmanly behavior could end not just in punishment, but in a spectacle of degradation designed to unmake a man in the eyes of society. Castration was the ultimate terror. The blade didn't just remove flesh, it removed identity. To lose the genitals was to lose honor, lineage and masculinity all at once. Courts and lords used it as a weapon of control, parading victims before crowds so the punishment would linger longer than blood. Imagine standing bound in a square, forced to watch the executioner prepare the knife, knowing that what defined you in your world, your ability to father heirs, to prove virility, to exercise dominance, was about to be taken forever. And it wasn't just the punishment itself. The cruelty was layered with theater. Some men were forced to dress in women's clothing and march through towns, jeered at by their neighbors, mocked as half men. Adulterers, sodomites, and accused deviants were paraded in absurd costumes before their punishment fell, a grotesque medieval version of a perp walk. The goal was never just to hurt the body. It was to annihilate the reputation, to turn shame into a public feast. Homosexuality in particular was targeted with a special venom. Medieval law codes describe men burned alive, but often first mutilated. Their bodies were twisted into symbols of warning. This is what happens when you deviate from the so-called natural order. And yet, the irony is unavoidable. Many of the same noble courts that condemned men for forbidden love were themselves rife with rumors of secret liaisons. The hypocrisy dripped thicker than the blood in the punishment square. Even accusations of impotence could trigger humiliation. A man unable to satisfy his wife might find himself dragged into court, examined by officials, mocked as useless. Some were ordered to undergo tests of virility, public trials, where their inability to perform condemned them to ridicule. Failure in the bedroom became failure as a man, and the punishment was designed to broadcast that shame far and wide. And then there were the mock parades. Men caught in scandal could be tied backwards on donkeys, forced to hold symbols of their disgrace while the crowd spat, laughed, and hurled insults. Others were beaten with birch rods as they were marched through the streets, the sting of the blows mingling with the deeper wound of humiliation. Medieval justice was rarely content with simple punishment. It wanted spectacle. It wanted humiliation to echo. The psychological cruelty was as sharp as the physical. Castration left men not only mutilated, but exiled from the very idea of manhood. They could not marry, could not inherit, could not even command respect. In a world obsessed with lineage and virility, a castrated man became a living ghost, and that was precisely the point. The punishment was engineered not just to end a life, but to erase a legacy. It's tempting to see these punishments as relics of a barbaric past. But the echoes remain. Modern scandals may not end with knives in public squares, but the obsession with humiliation survives in tabloids, in viral shaming, in the spectacle of lives destroyed not just by law, but by public judgment. The medieval stage was just bloodier, more literal, and yet, as grotesque as these humiliations were, they didn't always happen in the open square. Sometimes, the nightmare crept into the very place meant to be most private. Because in the medieval world, even the bedroom wasn't safe. Behind closed doors, even among the elite, sexuality became a stage for instruments, games, and excesses that make today's scandals look almost innocent. And what happened there reveals a hypocrisy that cuts even deeper. While peasants scraped for crumbs, nobles dined on lust. In the candlelit halls of castles, as serfs starved outside their gates, the medieval elite turned sex into theatre, indulgence and mockery. The very men who wrote laws against fornication and preached chastity at court feasts often spent their nights in chambers, echoing with laughter, moans, and the clinking of goblets. For them, morality was a sermon for the poor. Pleasure was their privilege. The hypocrisy drips from the records. While the church warned that the human body was shameful, noble courts quietly imported aphrodisiacs, oysters, spiced wines, rare herbs, believing lust could be sharpened like a sword with the right banquet. The feasts blurred into orgies, where music softened into moans, and where power was measured not just in land or soldiers, but in how many lovers one could command. And yes, sex toys existed. Forget the sanitized myths that medieval people were prudish. Archaeologists have uncovered phallic objects carved from horn, wood, even animal parts, often fashioned into dildos that would not look out of place in a modern shop, except cruder, heavier, more grotesque. Some were wrapped in leather harnesses or bound with straps, designed to turn flesh into playthings. Others were gilded, decorated for nobles who wanted their excesses to sparkle. These weren't just tools of pleasure, they were symbols of status, trophies flaunted in private chambers. For noble women, toys sometimes filled the gaps left by absent husbands gone to war or politics. For noblemen, they were curiosities, novelties to heighten orgies already swollen with excess. Rumors circulated of queens and mistresses who commanded entire rooms of attendants, using straps and devices while poets whispered about their exploits in coded verse. Whether exaggerated or not, the whispers reveal a truth. The elite did not abstain, they experimented, indulged and flaunted their freedom in ways peasants could only imagine. The grotesque irony is that the same hands raising goblets in an orgy might, the next morning, sign decrees punishing commoners for adultery. A farmer's wife caught in infidelity could be flogged, while a baroness could entertain 3 lovers under her husband's nose, without consequence. Morality was a ladder. The higher you climbed, the less it applied. Even kings played their part. In England, Edward II was accused by chroniclers of indulging with male favorites in ways that scandalized his court. In France, whispers of orgiastic banquets swirled around the Valois line. In Italy, the Borgia family would become infamous for their late-night games, feasts where food and flesh mingled until dawn. Whether embellished or not, the persistence of these stories shows how firmly sex clung to power in the medieval imagination. To peasants starving in the shadow of castles, the disparity was obscene. Their bodies were policed, their marriages scrutinized, their reputations fragile as glass. Meanwhile, the elite turned sex into theater, indulgence into ritual, their sins gilded by wealth. It was morality upside down, a double standard so absurd it verged on parody, if only the cruelty weren't so real. But beneath the laughter, beneath the banquets and the toys, there lingered a darker cost. The indulgence of the elite was still indulgence in a world riddled with disease, with punishment, with fear. Their games may have glittered, but they spread consequences far beyond the chamber walls. Lust could infect, desire could kill, and the hypocrisy of the rich was a cruelty that echoed downward onto those who had no freedom at all. And yet, for all the hypocrisy, all the excess, all the grotesque devices of pleasure, none of it compares to what came next. Because beyond humiliation, beyond indulgence, lay the final horror, when sexuality itself turned deadly, when desire became a death sentence, and when the most private of acts became the grounds for execution. Desire is supposed to give life. In the medieval world, it often gave death. What began as humiliation in courts and bedrooms ended for many in sickness, execution, or torture disguised as justice. By the late Middle Ages, sex itself was not just scandalous or sinful, it was lethal. The most obvious killer was disease. When syphilis erupted across Europe at the end of the 15th century, it tore through populations like wildfire, disfiguring bodies and rotting flesh from the inside out. But the cure was almost worse than the illness. Doctors prescribed mercury, a toxic metal smeared on skin, injected or inhaled in vapors. Patients drooled uncontrollably. Their gums turned black. Their teeth fell out. Some died not from the disease, but from the so-called medicine meant to heal them. Sex became a gamble. One night of pleasure could lead to years of agony, ending in madness and decay. But disease wasn't the only death sentence. In courts and villages, accusations of seduction and lust became weapons in themselves. A woman might be executed not for what she did, but for what men claimed she inspired. Records are filled with stories of women burned or drowned for the crime of bewitching men with their beauty. If a man strayed, it was easier to blame a woman's body than his own desire. The victim became the criminal, her flesh made into a warning, and the tests of chastity were cruel theater masquerading as law. A woman accused of infidelity might be forced to plunge her hands into boiling water or walk barefoot across red-hot iron. If her flesh healed clean, she was innocent. If not, she was guilty. Of course, the human body has no miraculous way of resisting fire. These trials were traps. Failure was inevitable, and the punishment followed swiftly: disgrace, mutilation, sometimes death. The cruelty extended even further in the witch hunts. Sexuality was twisted into evidence of sorcery. A widow living alone might be accused of lying with demons. A midwife who knew too much about reproduction might be branded a witch, tortured until she confessed to sleeping with the devil. Their bodies were violated in interrogations, stripped and searched for marks of lust, any blemish that could be twisted into proof of a pact with darkness. Then they were marched to the stake, where their supposed sins were burned from the world in a frenzy of smoke and screams. The hypocrisy is unbearable. Men of power could indulge in brothels, orgies, even affairs without fear of death. But for women, sexuality was a razor's edge. One step wrong, one rumor too strong, and it could cost everything. The same society that demanded they be desirable punished them for being desired. Their beauty was framed as temptation, their touch as witchcraft, their survival as sin. And behind it all was the same obsession: control. Sexuality, whether in medicine, in law, or in rumor, was never truly about lust. It was about power, who had it and who didn't. Disease punished the body. Courts punished the reputation. Witch trials punished the very existence of desire. In every case, the human cost was devastating. Imagine the dread of living in such a world. To feel attraction was to risk accusation. To fall ill was to risk a cure worse than the sickness. To be beautiful was to invite suspicion. To be unlucky was to be branded a witch. Sex was no longer just dangerous. It was fatal. This was the final stage of the medieval sexual nightmare, when desire itself became a death sentence. And while the Middle Ages are long gone, the echoes remain. The fear of female sexuality, the shaming of victims, the hypocrisy of power. These are ghosts that still haunt us. What we call progress is only the fragile distance we've placed between then and now. But back then, in the dark heart of medieval Europe, lust could kill you, justice could burn you, and even love itself could be the most dangerous